Are the Gospels historically accurate? Well, this video on Frank Turek's channel seems to think so, but when you go down the theological rabbit hole, don't be surprised when things go wonky. Now, even though this is a video on Frank Turek's channel, I want to point out that it isn't Frank that's answering this question. It's J. Warner Wallace. Just wanted to get that out of the way for the sake of accuracy. But this is really a good example of an apologist trying desperately to rationalize their way to a pre-existing belief by only giving you some of the information, only the parts that support his narrative, while conveniently ignoring everything else that throws the whole thing into doubt. So here I go with J. Warner Wallace trying to show that the Gospels are historically accurate while not understanding anything about them at all.
That's good. An apologetic question comes in about the scripture. How do we know the disciples died martyrs' deaths? How do we know the testimony about their deaths is accurate, since those who wrote about it were writing hundreds of years later? I think writing, how do we know that we can trust the historicity of the gospel accounts in the Bible? Any of you can take that.
Those are two entirely different questions being asked there, because the death of the disciples, for the most part, isn't even contained in the Gospels. In fact, I think there's only one recorded there. The rest are just church tradition and legend written decades or centuries later. And it has nothing to do whatsoever with the historicity of the Gospels or anything else in the Bible. I just wanted to make that very clear.
Well, we're talking about the deaths of the disciples. Do they die as martyrs? That's a different story than about where they're trying to check the reliability of the scriptures, because the deaths of the disciples are only really who we have described. We have the death of James, the brother of John, in 44 AD, described in the book of Acts. But for the most part, we're trusting a non-canonical book later in history for how these folks died.
And surprisingly, he gets that right. Very good, Mr. Wallace. Now, I'm kind of curious if he's going to try to conflate those two questions, though, because Turek's video is titled, How We Can Know That the Gospels Are Historically Accurate. And the death of the disciples gives us no information on that whatsoever.
And the claim has always been, well, look, I've always said that if you're going to die, if you said, I'm willing to die for Christianity as a Christian, that does nothing evidentially for me to demonstrate evidentially the value of your statement.
Again, absolutely true. I'm kind of impressed here. We see people willing to die for their beliefs all the time. Radical Muslims strap on bomb vests with alarming regularity. That doesn't prove that Islam is true. We see Buddhist priests lighting themselves on fire. That doesn't prove Buddhism is true. And I'm sure we could find many other cases where people in a fit of religious or, hey, even non-religious fervor have thrown their lives away because of something they believed in. This has no bearing whatsoever on the correctness of their beliefs, only in the delusion of the individual.
But because you're not an eyewitness to the account. Lots of people die for what they do not know is a lie.
And he hits the nail on the head once again. But I bet he won't draw the obvious parallel to his own beliefs here. The religious very rarely do. Oh, those crazy people over there who killed themselves for that silly belief? Well, that just proves how insane they are. But when it happens for my cause, well, that just proves how valid my beliefs are.
But if you're amongst those who would have actually known if it was a lie, and then you're willing to die for this claim, that has tremendous evidential value to me.
Except it doesn't. And the problem we have here is that most of the so-called disciples can't be demonstrated to have ever existed in the first place, nor can the circumstances of their deaths be independently ascertained. As I said before, most of this rests solely in church tradition, and the church has a vested interest in maintaining this particular religious narrative. Besides, we've got all kinds of modern examples of religious fervor, such as the Branch Davidians, who believed David Koresh was the return of Jesus, who were willing to die for him. Can you make the same argument that, hey, these people ought to know if David Koresh was really Jesus, so the fact that they were willing to die for him proves that he was?
Because you'll be the one person who would know if it was a lie. So the question is, did they really all die as martyrs? Now,
and that's a good question. But again, the church has every reason to doctor the truth to maintain its power and influence. We know for a fact that it did so on many, many occasions. We know, for instance, that early Christians modified the writings of Josephus to help convert the gullible. We know that it went on. In fact, Bart Ehrman wrote a book on it called Forgery and Counterforgery, describing a lot of the instances where we know that it happened. So I think that we have to at least consider the possibility that the stories were at least embellished, if not outright fabricated. Again, this has nothing whatsoever to do with the historicity of the Gospels, which have to stand or fall on their own merits.
a lot of work's been done on this. I think some of the best work that's been done recently was done by Sean McDowell in a book called The Fate of the Apostles. It's a very expensive, it's his PhD dissertation, so it's very expensive.
Yeah, and you know who his father is? Josh McDowell, author of those absurdly laughable books on evidence that supposedly demands a verdict, probably some of the most ripped apart theological works in the modern age. And he also works with people like William Dembski, the creationist Looney Tune, who worked with the Discovery Institute, best known for making a complete fool of itself in the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial. So yeah, I don't think that McDowell has any real credibility here, sorry.
But long story short, we have a kind of a level of certainty where I can be a lot more certain about the death of Peter, for example, than I can be about the death of Philip. Okay.
The problem is, you really don't have any certainty about the death of Peter. Acts 2, 1-17 suggests, according to some at least, that Peter might have died as early as 44 CE, but church tradition holds that Peter didn't die until 64 CE, just after the Great Fire of Rome, where he was supposedly crucified upside down. Nero, who was desperate to blame the Christians for the disaster, hunted notable Christians to be put to death. So there's a 20-year span in there where Peter could have died. Plus, we've really got no independent sources indicating his actual method of death outside of church teachings, which, as I said, they had both the motive and the demonstrable history of being less than honest. The point here is that they really don't know anything, and even if they did, that still has nothing at all to do with the veracity of the Gospels.
Here's what I do know, though. Within the second or third generation of Christians, if you could get a Christian to deny Christ as Lord and go back to the Roman gods, you wrote about it. Because Pliny the Younger writes to Trajan and says, hey, I'm getting these people who weren't eyewitnesses, people who just learned from the eyewitnesses, I'm torturing them or pushing them back toward the Roman gods. Because it seems to me one way to end the game early, get the body of Jesus, drag it around town. That's game over. That didn't happen.
And that assumes that there was a body of Jesus in the first place. Now, even if we assume that there was some real historical analog to Jesus that the Romans nailed to a cross, the whole point of crucifixion was to completely desecrate the body. It wasn't taken down and buried, it was left up there to rot and be eaten by animals. So, a century or more later, they wouldn't have had a body to drag around if they wanted to. But the religious want to assume that just because it says something in their big book of multiple choice, it had to be true. And there's simply no independently verifiable evidence that that's so.
Or get those who said they saw him alive to recant. And guess what? That didn't happen either. And we know they were looking to do it because when they got a second generation Christian to do it, they talked about it.
You don't know that. Because again, we know the church actively destroyed documents that disagreed with their narrative. We know that by 326 CE, Constantine authorized the confiscation and destruction of anything that fell outside of orthodoxy. For more than 1,000 years, it was the Christians who were responsible for wiping out an unimaginable amount of human knowledge. I really ought to do a video on just how much damage Christianity has done to the world. Regardless, though, we only know what Christians have left to be known, or what was purposely hidden from the Christian invaders. That goes for literature, archaeology, paintings, architecture, philosophy, infrastructure, you name it. Christianity has been the biggest destroyer of information the world has ever known. So saying that you know how things happened is simply not true. You know what your forefathers wanted you to know, and that's only a very tiny part of the story.
What we don't have is a single ancient document in which any opponent of Christianity could ever say that one of the eyewitnesses recanted. That's not there.
Because you can't prove that there were any actual eyewitnesses. And you'll notice that when the apologists are looking for extra biblical accounts of Jesus, they can never find any that are contemporary with Jesus. Not one. They trot out Josephus, who was a forgery, but he wasn't born until after Jesus was supposedly dead. Not Tacitus, not Lucian, not Celsus, not Suetonius, not Mara bar Serpion. None of these people were alive at the point in time that Jesus supposedly was. But you know who was around at that time? Some of the greatest historians of the ancient age. People like Philo and Seneca and Velleius and Pliny the Elder. But these contemporaries to Jesus apparently never heard of him. And even for those who came later, they were all operating on hearsay or reporting on the existence of Christians, not on the actual Jesus. This is just vastly overstating your case.
And we have a variety of either higher or level authorities telling us about how the disciples did die for their beliefs. So I'm pretty comfortable, based on that cumulative case, that we have people who died for their claims.
Which, again, doesn't prove anything. And just because you're comfortable doesn't mean you ought to be. You are talking about the most extraordinary claim in the history of extraordinary claims. That the Son of the Creator of the universe came to earth, did miracles, died, and rose from the dead. That's going to take a lot more than, "I feel comfortable," to be convincing.
By the way, that doesn't necessarily make them true, but it's part of that cumulative case that I would put together in front of a jury that I think would be compelling.
Now you say that. Because if they're not true, then they're not worth paying attention to except as a historical curiosity. I think he realized that he vastly overstated his case. But this isn't a jury trial. That's not how historicity works. It's not up for a vote. It isn't the ability to con a bunch of ignorant, uninterested yokels who would rather not be there in the first place to vote your way. And I think it's funny that that's the standard of proof that so many apologists go with. Because I think when it comes right down to it, the apologist really doesn't care about the truth. It feels good, and they're looking for a way to rationalize their pre-existing beliefs so they sound more palatable to people who are increasingly becoming too educated to fall for these things anymore. But they aren't going to give you the whole truth, are they?
That's good.
Sure, that's good. It's good that he reaches an emotionally comforting conclusion and can answer the question in a half-assed way that doesn't actually provide any evidence for any of the things asked in the initial question. Because, if you remember, this started off trying to equate the stories of the deaths of the apostles with the validity of the Gospels, and he really didn't address either of those. Yes, it was a short answer, and I'm sure he could have done better if he had had more time, but I doubt that he would have given any of the information that I provided because it doesn't benefit him and his beliefs to do so. And that's because he, like any apologist, isn't really interested in the truth. He just wants to find a way to support the things that he's up on stage being paid to support. And these people are being paid. This isn't charity. This is how they make a living. And I'm certainly not begrudging them doing it. I'm just pointing out that the person that you're paying to sell you a product probably isn't the best objective source of information on what product is best. Well, theirs, of course. This goes for cars, this goes for shampoo, and it certainly goes for religion. They have a vested interest in selling their product to the audience so the audience will keep tossing money in the collection plate and paying their honorariums. That's how this works. And that's why we have to take what they say with a grain of salt, checking out every word coming out of their mouths, because they're being paid to shill this particular theological position. They might actually believe it, but that doesn't make them an objectively valid or trustworthy source. And these things matter. They matter to us, and they ought to matter to them. And unfortunately, they don't and won't. And that's sad.